Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're skipping the usual agenda because we aren't just looking at a single, isolated organ. We're actually stepping inside a vast, incredibly complex biological web. You see, for centuries, modern medicine treated the human body like a collection of isolated machines. You know, the brain handles thought, the stomach handles digestion, the immune system fights off the bad guys, but cutting-edge clinical science is revealing a dramatically different reality. The systems that govern our deepest cognitive states, our metabolic health, and ultimately our longevity, they're all deeply physically intertwined in what we call an inner ecosystem.
It's kind of the ultimate question in modern health, isn't it? What is really in the driver's seat of our biology? Okay, let's dive into this. We instinctively assume that the brain, resting inside our skull, is the absolute architect of how we feel, how hungry we get, and how fast our metabolism runs. But the clinical evidence tells us that the brain in our head is, at best, only half the story. There is literally a second brain operating right now inside your gastrointestinal tract, and it's quietly dictating biological commands that influence everything from the deep architecture of your sleep to your daytime cravings to your overall metabolic health and aging.
To truly understand who's running the show down there, you have to wrap your head around this staggering number: 100 trillion. That's the estimated number of microorganisms spanning over 7,000 distinct strains living inside your gastrointestinal tract right now. Collectively, we call this your gut microbiome. Just to put that into perspective for you, these microbes contain roughly 100 times more genetic material than your own human genome. It's wild. But while the diversity is vast, a healthy adult microbiome is predominantly governed by just two major bacterial families: Firmicutes and Bacteroides. When we feed them properly, they act like a highly specialized 24/7 internal pharmacy. They continuously manufacture the biochemical molecules that keep your metabolism lean, your mind sharp, and your immune system totally resilient.
So the absolutely crucial point here is, what happens when this delicate ecosystem collapses? Clinically, we call this state dysbiosis. It happens when the harmonious balance of those dominant bacteria is completely thrown off. And the triggers? Well, they're basically the hallmarks of modern life. We're talking diets high in highly processed foods, chronic psychological stress, and fragmented, poor-quality sleep. When dysbiosis sets in, the protective mucosal barrier of your gut literally begins to break down. This structural breakdown is the critical origin point for systemic inflammation. Harmful pathogens start to expand, profound fatigue sets in, metabolic function just stalls out, and those critical communication lines between your gut and your brain, they become severely compromised.
Chapter 1. The Gut-Brain Axis.
Now, we know the gut and the brain communicate, but how exactly does an invisible little microbe in your colon send a text message to the brain sitting up in your skull? It relies on the vagus nerve. Think of it as a massive, high-speed information superhighway that links your enteric nervous system, which is your gut's local brain, directly to your central nervous system. This isn't a metaphor, it's a profound anatomical reality. Remarkably, about 80% of the fibers in the vagus nerve are afferent. That means they're sending sensory information from the gut up to the brain, not the other way around. Now, these nerve fibers don't actually touch the bacteria directly. Instead, they interact with specialized enteroendocrine cells lining your gut. These cells act like tiny biological sensors. They detect the chemical signals produced by your gut bacteria, and they instantly relay that data up the vagus nerve to tell your brain how to regulate appetite, stress, and digestion.
And the language these microbes use to communicate? It's entirely chemical. Your gut bacteria are actively manufacturing incredibly powerful neuroactive compounds. Take serotonin, for example. We always think of it as a brain chemical, right? But specialized cells in the gut actually produce the vast majority of your body's serotonin, and this is heavily influenced by specific gut bacteria to regulate your mood and your sleep cycles. Then we have GABA. This is an inhibitory neurotransmitter that acts like the brakes on your nervous system, calming central anxiety and fear responses. And crucially, we have short-chain fatty acids, or SCFAs, like butyrate. When you digest dietary fiber, your microbes ferment it into these SCFAs. Butyrate is an absolute clinical powerhouse. It literally travels up to the brain to preserve the blood-brain barrier, and it acts as an epigenetic switch to actively suppress neuroinflammation.
Which brings us to an absolute metabolic superstar: endogenous GLP-1. You've probably heard a lot about GLP-1 lately, but your body actually produces its own natural GLP-1. It's a gut-derived peptide secreted by those exact same enteroendocrine cells we were just talking about. And here's where the biological web connects perfectly. The release of this natural GLP-1 is directly stimulated by those short-chain fatty acids produced by your healthy gut bacteria. When your microbiome is thriving, It triggers a steady, perfectly calibrated release of GLP-1 along with another hormone called PYY. These hormones travel straight to the brain to signal profound satiety, effectively turning off that neurological drive to overeat. But endogenous GLP-1 is doing so much more behind the scenes. It actively regulates insulin secretion, helps preserve lean muscle tissue, and slows cellular metabolic aging. It's truly a cornerstone of human longevity.
Chapter 2: Stress, Sleep, and Dysbiosis. But what happens when we throw a wrench into this beautifully orchestrated system? We often treat lifestyle factors like sleep and stress as sort of secondary to our health, right? But structurally, biologically, they're the environmental forces that dictate whether your good microbes live or die. Let's walk through this biological cascade. Consider what happens when your sleep architecture falls apart. When you chronically miss out on restorative deep sleep and REM sleep, your brain perceives that as a literal biological threat. It hits the panic button. It responds by chronically elevating cortisol and activating the sympathetic nervous system, sending massive distress signals directly down to the gut. This surge of stress hormones fundamentally alters the intestinal environment. The good bacteria die off, and harmful bacteria are suddenly allowed to release toxins. This spikes systemic inflammation, which directly degrades and weakens that gut barrier, allowing toxins to leak right into your bloodstream. And under this intense stress and dysbiosis, your natural GLP-1 production just plummets. Your appetite surges, your mood drops, and the vagus nerve's calming tone is completely suppressed. It is a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle of metabolic decline.
Chapter 3: The Clinical Intervention.
So, the million-dollar question: how do we break this cycle and actually rebuild this inner ecosystem? Well, this brings us to a landmark piece of modern science. It's a groundbreaking, randomized controlled trial out of Stanford University that set out to test exactly how our diet reshapes the microbiome and the immune system. The researchers took 36 healthy adults and split them into 2 highly controlled groups for 10 weeks. Group 1 dramatically increased their dietary fiber to about 45 grams per day, eating lots of beans, vegetables, and whole grains. The other group was tasked with eating 6 servings a day of fermented foods. We're talking yogurt, kefir, kimchi, and kombucha. Going into the study, the researchers completely assumed fiber would be the undisputed king. The prevailing scientific theory at the time was simple. If you provide the microbes with their favorite fuel, microbial diversity will naturally explode.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why we do clinical trials, because the results were stunningly counterintuitive. Just look at this data. For the high-fiber group, taxonomic diversity, which is the sheer variety of microbial life in the gut, remained utterly unchanged. No change at all. Their systemic inflammation remained completely stable too. In fact, researchers found unfermented fiber in their stool, meaning these participants literally lacked the specific microbes needed to actually process all that extra fiber. But the high fermented foods group, they experienced a steady, progressive, and highly significant increase in microbial diversity, alongside an expansion of entirely distinct microbial taxa. It was a massive scientific reveal.
But honestly, the most profound clinical endpoint was what happened to the immune systems of the people eating the fermented foods. 19. That is the exact number of inflammatory cytokines and chemokines that significantly decreased in their blood. And this included a steep documented drop in a specific marker called interleukin-6. Now, why is that so monumental? Because interleukin-6 is a primary driver of chronic systemic inflammation. It's heavily linked to metabolic aging and cognitive decline. Lowering it means the fermented foods weren't just helping digestion, they were acting as a highly potent, broad-spectrum anti-inflammatory intervention. They were essentially putting the brakes on the biological aging process.
Yet, here is the real scientific mystery that makes this so fascinating. You'd probably assume the people eating all that kimchi and kefir were just depositing the bacteria from those foods directly into their colon, right? But as Dr. Christopher Gardner pointed out, when they sequenced the DNA, only 5% of the new bacteria blooming in the volunteers' guts actually matched the strains in the fermented foods they were eating. The bacteria from the food didn't just move in and set up camp. They acted as ecological engineers. They fundamentally changed the pH and the environment of the gut, which allowed dormant, undetectable microbes that were already hiding out in there to suddenly wake up, multiply, and bloom into a thriving ecosystem. It's incredible.
Now, we have to be completely objective here and reconcile these findings. This study absolutely does not mean fiber is useless. Actually, scratch that. Fiber remains completely non-negotiable. It is the essential fuel required to produce those protective short-chain fatty acids and to trigger that beautiful rush of endogenous GLP-1 we talked about earlier. However, what the Stanford study reveals is a very precise order of operations. Think about it. If your inner ecosystem has been wiped out by stress, poor sleep, and processed food, just dumping fiber into it won't magically fix things.
Without a diverse microbiome already in place to actually ferment that fiber, it just passes right through you. You have to seed and prepare the environment first.
Chapter 4. Building a Resilient Gut.
So, taking all of this incredibly deep clinical data, how do we actually apply it to our own health, metabolism, and longevity? Well, it requires a holistic playbook that respects the entire biological web. First, to structurally remodel the gut environment and wake up those dormant microbes, we need to incorporate diverse fermented foods into our daily routine. Second, once that environment is primed and ready, we gradually increase dietary fiber. That gives our microbes the exact fuel they need to produce mood-boosting serotonin and metabolism-regulating GLP-1. Third, and this is absolutely crucial, we have to protect the system by prioritizing our circadian rhythms and our sleep architecture. Remember, getting restorative, deep sleep prevents the massive cortisol spikes that literally tear holes in the gut barrier. And finally, we have to practice active stress reduction. Calming the mind maintains the tone of the vagus nerve, ensuring those powerful anti-inflammatory signals keep flowing smoothly between your two brains.
Trying to treat the brain, the metabolism, and the digestive tract as separate, isolated systems just doesn't align with the reality of human biology. They are one continuous, highly conversational loop. Every single meal you eat, every hour of deep sleep you secure, and every stressful thought you process is either nourishing or damaging this invisible, microscopic world inside of you. So I'll leave you with this final thought to consider. Armed with everything you know now, how will you feed your inner ecosystem today?